I just want to highlight a selection of the key kind of areas of debate but also contention in this field. Over the last 5 to 10 years, this topic actually has resurfaced a number of times in relation to different things. But the debate itself actually has largely failed to move on, and that's really what prompted Simon and I to create this report. What we found is actually that quite a lot of this ground in terms of the relationship between climate change and conflict has actually been fairly well worn now. There's 3 kind of areas where this debate has come up. Firstly, there's been a lot of debate around the causes of climate-related violence. And there's a lot of studies that have been put out that try and compare and contrast climatic change with different patterns of violence and armed conflict. Now, there's also been a lot of strong criticism of this kind of analysis. It oversimplistically plucks 2 different parts of what are often very complex contexts and then tries to compare them and develop a relationship. We wouldn't really try and use this kind of analysis in our home ground. For example, if you look at the violence of 2011 in London, we're certainly not trying to compare that prevalence of violence against examining rainfall or temperature, so it's strange that we would do that elsewhere. Second is this idea of hotspot maps, and you may have seen them. They often essentially look like a map of the world, and often a traffic-like system is applied. We essentially have countries that are coloured in red that are deemed to be most at risk of climate-related violence. The idea with these is that if aid agencies or policymakers are trying to tackle the challenge of climate-related conflict, then they need to understand where those hotspots are going to be and where they need to invest their money. The problem with this, of course, is that actually that fails to disaggregate beyond a country level. And countries are often attributed to being red for danger, when actually we know that nothing as simplistic as that. It also ignores all of the work that's gone on so far around the role of borderlands in conflicts. The third area where we've seen this debate happening most, and certainly is the most covered in the media, is the idea of securitization, the idea that climate change poses a security threat. Now, that was largely prompted by the UN Security Council putting climate change on its agenda back in 2007. And avid believers of the implications, the security implications of climate change, often argue that actually it's those vulnerable to climate change that have become the threat to our national security. Unsurprisingly, this too has also received a lot of criticism. It's received criticism and resistance, particularly from the UN member states who did not want it on the Security Council in the first place. But it's also quite interesting to see how there's more evidence coming out that climate advocates have actually understood the political savvy nature of linking climate change to security. And actually it's helped them to increase the visibility of climate change in a world where climate change was not taken seriously enough back in 2007. Now, as a reaction to these 3 elements, there's been a number of attempts to try and bring much more nuance to this debate. So trying to bring in ideas around different governance structures, adaptive capacity and political economy, all of which mediate and moderate conditions of conflict. The reality certainly that we're starting from here is firstly that climate change is a global challenge which isn't bound by country borders, and that climate change does and will affect fragile and conflict-affected states. Secondly, that how we understand the linkages between these things significantly affects how we decide to act on them. Now, we've got a short video, and it shows a few illustrations of the way that this debate has been talked about so far.
The UN says climate change is a threat to world peace. Now its Security Council is proposing a new environmental peacekeeping force to step into conflicts caused by shrinking resources. Are we looking at a new role for the UN? And what should be done to eliminate the root causes of global warming before dealing with the security consequences?
The tragic conflict in Syria provides a terrifyingly graphic example where a severe drought for the last 7 years has decimated Syria's rural economy, driving many farmers off their fields into the cities, where already food was in short supply. And this depletion of natural capital, inexplicably little reported in the media, was a significant contributor to the social tension that exploded with such desperate results.
Our last dimension of vulnerability is governance and political violence. And what that takes into account is many instances, the effects of extreme weather events will often surpass the capacities of local communities to protect themselves. And when that occurs, whether or not large numbers of people suffer and die will ultimately be determined by how good their governments are in terms of effectiveness, openness to the concerns of the community. And we try to capture that through measures of government effectiveness, voice and accountability, integration in the global system, and measures of political stability, as well as subnational indicators of political violence.
Okay, so what does this actually mean in practice? How do we support communities that are dealing with climate change who are also living in very difficult governance contexts? As was alluded to in the videos, this is about more than a simplistic equation of increased climate change equals increased conflict. So the debate has moved on a little bit, but actually not far enough. This is a quote from an NGO practitioner working on resilience and climate change adaptation. They said, "This shouldn't be about doing climate change adaptation work in fragile and conflict-affected states. It should be about building the capacity, dare I say it, the resilience, to deal with climate, disaster, conflict, economic, and political shocks of any kind." But actually, should we be doing adaptation in these kind of conflicts at all? A former UN staff member who worked on a number of armed conflict situations, he said, "We have to get our priorities right and in the right order. Climate change action is important in humanitarian crisis, but we have to question exactly what it means in each context. 7 out of every $10 of humanitarian funding is spent on conflict on complex emergencies. If I had the choice, I'd spend all the climate change action money on bringing peace to those contexts first. If not, you risk throwing good money away." But even if you do agree that supporting adaptation is needed in difficult contexts, can we actually do it? A researcher looking at aid effectiveness in fragile states said, "It's actually really difficult to effectively spend money in conflict contexts. It requires an approach that's much more flexible and less risk-averse, and potentially difficult to achieve against the backdrop of the current results and value for money agenda." Now, this is particularly problematic when you consider that recent evidence, including from institutions such as ODI, point to fragile and conflict-affected states being amongst the most vulnerable to climate change over the next 20 years. And in some ways, we've set ourselves up for working on these difficult topics. We've set ourselves up for trying to address the interconnections between climate change and conflict, amongst other issues, because of resilience. "The whole point of resilience," said a donor working on resilience policy, "is to do something different, to think about how we link together issues that we haven't done so successfully in the past. If we do the same thing over and over, we're not going to get anywhere." So the resilience agenda seems to point us in this direction, to address the complexity of risk in both development and humanitarian contexts. Resilience points us towards tackling, or as a minimum, not ignoring, the need for action on climate change, whether this is in peaceful or conflict-affected contexts. But despite the resilience rhetoric, this is not happening in practice. A workshop report from a consortium of agencies working on resilience said, "Although recognizing conflict as a key element of underlying causes to vulnerability, we've chosen to keep conflict out of our discussion on the resilience of communities to natural disasters, because it was felt that this complex dimension would add too much complexity." So I would then ask, can you work on resilience with such blinkered approaches? Now, I really must stress, we don't doubt that those working in the aid business, whether as practitioners, policymakers, in the media, or as researchers, understand the nuance and complexity of these issues. But why are we struggling, therefore, to move this debate forward? Climate change is affecting communities in fragile and conflict-affected states, and we have a duty to take action on climate change. So if climate aid is targeted, therefore, at need, we will need to spend more in these difficult contexts. But how do we do that in a way that doesn't risk climate action being a catalyst for conflict? And what institutional, financial, disciplinary and political barriers do we need to overcome to ensure this isn't the case?
Katie, thank you very much indeed. Can I just check one thing with you? Did you say there that if it was up to you, you would spend all the money that's currently being spent to climate change mitigation on, in effect, conflict resolution? Is that what you said?
Yeah, that came from a person that used to work in the UN in conflict contexts.
And you share that view, do you?
I wouldn't necessarily share that view, no.
Right. But it's strong. It's quite widely held within some people in the.
I've heard that on a number of occasions. Yeah, I mean the quotes that I pulled out are representative of groups of people. They're not just one-off isolated people.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to come to Simon next.